The second service was to illustrate the barriers and brokenness that are present in our congregation, since we're not perfect. We're just working on sending forth visible saints, but you know, we're all on a journey to get there.
The challenge is that we're told that we don't need each other, that we really ought to be able to do it alone, that we, if we're young, we really ought to think ourselves wiser than the elders. The elders are no longer useful, because how could they understand how to communicate with us if it's not on Twitter?
So we wanted to illustrate some of the common barriers and brokenness on that journey to wholeness that we're all on and that we're all experiencing. So we had different testimonials about experiences in that.
Utah is the center of my genealogy, my religion, and my past. I was born a 9th generation Mormon, about an hour south of this convention center, where my dad was attending Brigham Young University. My ancestors were among Joseph Smith's original followers when he founded, in 1830, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormon or LDS Church. One ancestor provided Joseph Smith's last meal as a free man before he was shot in jail in 1844. My ancestors also participated in polygamy as the saints migrated west. Raising my sister and me faithfully in the LDS Church caused my parents to seriously evaluate their beliefs, particularly as I was about to be baptized that year when I turned 8. My parents determined that they really did not believe the core doctrines and decided to formally leave the LDS Church, primarily to avoid my extended family from converting my sister and I. My childhood experience of multi-generational community in Mormonism and my lifelong connection to it even 10 years later is vastly different from what I have experienced in Unitarian Universalism. I have been UU since I was in grade 6, and until very recently, my connection to Unitarian Universalism has been related almost exclusively to people my age. In middle school, it was to my RE group and my ALT group. In high school, it was to my youth group. I have always had strong relationships with adults in my life, so it always felt really weird to have the only adults I knew be my three youth advisors and the DRE. The comparison that really concerns me at the end of the day, though, is that outside of people my age and those few adults, no one in my faith community knew my name. This has been true pretty much until the last 2 years, and that was only after I became involved in youth leadership at the national level. Contrast this to Mormonism, where my name, to a fair number of members of a faith community that I don't even remember, is still known. It's not like I didn't attend church every Sunday, because I did. But I've experienced distinct and real barriers in UU congregations, large and small, because I've attended both. And it's made it very difficult for me to form relationships with children, young adults, elders, lay leaders, and religious professionals in my community. If I never attend service, I never greet my neighbor during the offering, or really have any idea who my minister is. If I attend coffee hour and no one seems to want to talk to me, or the interactions that I do have are never meaningful, or they're superficial, then I stop going to coffee hour. If I never get to know anyone in the congregation, then I probably will not be involved in music, social justice, or theologically specific groups and opportunities. I can't give my time, talent, and love to my community. I can only give it to people my age within my community. If this is true for most children, youth, and often also young adults, then the whole community is stratified. The congregational community is often defined by the space of adults and elders, but think about how much time, talent, and love it is missing, and who it is missing. Luckily for me, I formed a relationship with my lead minister, became a member of my home congregation, and after giving one of the homilies at the annual youth service, got to know more adults and elders in my congregation, albeit on a more superficial level. Almost all of this was of my own accord, though, with encouragement from the few adults who I did know. However, this is not happening for most children, youth, and often also young adults in our faith. Our communities have real barriers that prevent us from coming together and forming spirit-sustaining and truly beautiful multi-generational community. If my only attachments to Unitarian Universalism involve people my age, when we end our time in religious education and go our separate ways at the end of high school, then what is Unitarian Universalism to those young Unitarian Universalists? It is not a religion at that point. Unitarian Universalism is an ever-fading memory that they may, but as statistics show, they more likely will not return to. To heal these barriers and brokenness, new relationships must be formed in multiple dimensions. In a way, youth have the name game easier because youth are often not wearing those handy name tags. It's admittingly difficult to spur up particularly meaningful conversation during coffee hour with someone who it seems you don't have anything in common with. But it is that much more difficult when you are both experiencing two different communities at the same time. You can't discuss the sermon because the youth most likely was not there. You can't discuss what happened in youth group because the adult most likely was not there. You can't discuss congregational politics because if the segregation is that far in, then the youth probably doesn't have any vested interest in being part of that community. And if we can have shared multi-generational experiences where multiple generations do something together, then we can have meaningful interaction that solidifies the bonds and the community itself. To know a person's name can be said to know something about a person's identity. If you can also remember something distinct about a person on top of their name, then the identity becomes more clear. When my mom and I run into random people from the Vancouver LDS Church, we're not wearing name tags. My mom, at that time a young married adult, and myself, at that time a young child, are former members of a community that still retains large fragments of our identities. That's much more than can be said for my experience as an older child and youth, and now as a young adult in Unitarian Universalism. Here then is another example of where we must overcome barriers and brokenness and find ways to come together, heal together, and weave together.
Well, my testimonial begins with telling you a little bit about the congregation that I serve. The demographics of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. is not typical of many Unitarian Universalist congregations. We have a large percentage of our membership that are young adults, folks in their 20s and 30s, and without a doubt, it is that segment of our community which is the fastest growing. So we find ourselves in an interesting place right now. We have some longtime members for whom the church's history is paramount. And we recently have sensed a growing gulf between those who have been around our congregation for a long period of time and the newcomers to our church, the 20s and 30s crowd. And so a meeting was called this spring to air some of the tensions between these two groups. And the conversation that followed was illuminating. Not that a resolution was found, not that all misunderstandings were put aside, but several themes emerged from that conversation, which I found quite fascinating. The first theme that I would describe to you is a theme about respecting and understanding that each generation has a very unique vantage point, a unique view from which they see the world, and that all of those viewpoints are valid, even when those viewpoints don't always agree. It seems, as I say it now, like that's self-evident and obvious that each generation has its own vantage point, has its own perspective, and that all of them are equally true and whole and real for those who have them. And yet somehow it seems to me like we're always thinking that those who are elder have the best vantage point on the world as it is today, or those who are young have the only vantage point on what is true and real in 2009, not respecting that each and every generation has a remarkable story to tell and a true vision of what is happening in our world today. The second illuminating theme that came out of that conversation had a lot to do with our current president and views of his election. You see, in Washington, where we've been profoundly impacted by our new neighbor at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we have had many conversations about what his election means. So perhaps you have had these conversations as well in your congregations. We've had those of the civil rights generation saying that while the election of President Obama was meaningful and significant, transformative and miraculous in many ways, it didn't mean that all had been accomplished yet. Younger folks, on the other hand, the Gen Xers, maybe even more so the millennials, were saying, this was it. We were now arrived at a sort of post-racial society where although race still would play a role, never would it again be the barrier that it had been before. During that conversation, a member of our congregation in her late 40s stood up and told a very moving story about how she, with her family, multiple generations of her family, African-American folks down on the mall, freezing their butts off like the rest of us who went down there for Obama's inauguration, were talking about what this meant. And she said her niece, after a while engaged in this conversation with her family, began to cry. She said, "You're not letting me simply enjoy this moment. I want to simply love what has happened today. I want to simply soak in the joy, and you just keep telling me that we're not there yet. But my perspective, my life is just as real and as true as yours. My vision of what has happened today is no less meaningful because I wasn't in Selma." The tears streamed down her face, and her family finally stepped back from their perspectives, their entrenched viewpoints, to see that each of them had a truth to tell that day. And lastly, one of the things that was illuminating to me from that conversation was the importance of that woman's story, leading me to what I think we get into a little bit too much, which is we seem to, when we get entrenched in our own viewpoint, we see other people as not getting it. That only if I could convert you to my way of seeing things, then you would get it. And then the tears come when we feel like somebody is actually saying to us, it's not that they don't get it, they just don't get us. They don't get me and who I am and where I'm coming from, and they don't want to. Or they're not interested in meeting me halfway and seeing my perspective on this, because they know what's true. They know what's real. And apparently my heart doesn't beat in the same way theirs does. So I lift up to you these places of brokenness that I think are also places of possibility. We all have a vantage point from whatever generation we are in. We need to respect those differences, see more clearly that all perspectives need to be included, that all are valid and true. And we need to move beyond, to move through not only a you don't get it, but a you don't get me place, to more fully embracing not just someone else's perspective, but someone else's whole person. May we make that move, each of us and all of our congregations.